guys, we're almost done. We got a couple chapters left. The past few chapters, we've been talking about freedom of speech, your First Amendment, and what that gives you. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the right to protest and assemble. In today's lesson, we're going to talk about what that means, how your right to protest is protected, and how it can be limited. In the image behind me, you can see people protesting for something very important. They're trying to get equal opportunity and end school segregation. Okay guys, so the last couple chapters have been about the First Amendment and freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and this is going to cover one of the last aspects of freedom of speech, freedom to petition and protest. So let's talk about a couple vocabulary words first. First word, assemble, means to gather. It's usually for a purpose. So just sitting around in a park, tossing a frisbee around, wouldn't be an assembly. An assembly is when people gather for a reason to accomplish something. A picket line is a specific type of protest, and it's a group of workers who are protesting, trying to change their work conditions. A lot of times you'll see this outside of factories. There were some examples of it on the news recently where Amazon workers were protesting, saying they were being treated unfairly and didn't have safe working conditions. And sometimes these protests can get out of control, and when they get out of control, they turn into riots. So let's give an example of how freedom to assemble and protest can be used to make changes. So suppose you think the police chief in your town is doing a bad job. You think the chief should be fired. You talk to your neighbors, they think so too. If these people agree with you, you might be able to do something about it. You might be able to use a recall or use a petition. So you want to talk your idea over with people in the town. You decide to have an open meeting in a town hall. So there you want everyone to sign a petition asking for the recall of the police chief. If enough people show up and say this is what they want, the government has to act upon it. So what happens, you start spreading the word, and a lot of your neighbors say, nah, we're not going to that meeting. They think the police chief will not allow this meeting to happen. They also think they're going to get arrested for going to this meeting to get the police chief fired. So should these people actually be worried? Can the police chief stop you from going to this meeting and arrest you? In some countries, yes, but in America, we have the First Amendment. And the First Amendment guarantees you the right to assemble and petition freely. Freedom of assembly means that groups of people can meet peacefully whenever they want within certain guidelines. So people can have public or private meetings and talk about ideas, even if those ideas are unpopular. They can organize themselves to make changes. They can try to get things, addressed in our government. They can try to get their concerns addressed. Freedom to petition means that people can specifically ask their government to make some change. And we've talked about that before. That's where you get enough signatures, and if you get enough signatures, you can force the government to make a change, like an initiative, a referendum, or a recall. So your right to speak freely is guaranteed by the Constitution, but it would not mean very much if you weren't able to actually put your ideas out there in public. So it's very easy to get your ideas out there in public, especially today. If you think about Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, people can reach a large audience relatively easily. Freedom to assemble gives you the right to organize people into larger groups. And in our government, remember, we make decisions by voting, by democracy. So there is power in numbers. The more people you have with you, the much more likely you are to get a change effected. So if you try to make a change by yourself with one person, your chances are much lower than if you have many, many people on your side. So the freedom to petition gives you the right to ask the government in writing for changes. If you think that the speed limit should be changed, you can use a petition. If you want to legalize recreational marijuana, you could use a petition. Both of these are protected under freedom of speech and freedom of the press. So suppose you want to make a speech and you want to criticize the government for something they're doing. There's been lots of people who have been out publicly speaking against these coronavirus restrictions, about the government shutdowns, about businesses not being allowed to be open. Some people are in support of it and some people are very, very against it. Both sides are allowed to have their opinion and put their opinion out there. Okay, so let's talk about what protections and limits come with freedom to petition, freedom to protest, and freedom to assemble. So the First Amendment gives you the right to hold any meeting as long as that meeting is peaceful and no illegal purposes. So if you wanted to have a meeting to discuss who the best quarterback in all NFL history was, and you think that it is Tim Couch from the Browns from years ago, you are allowed to have that meeting even though you're wrong, and you're allowed to invite as many people as you want to discuss it because you're not breaking any laws as long as this meeting stays peaceful. So what if the people in your meeting started going around throwing rocks through the window of anybody they saw with Steelers stuff at their house? That meeting would no longer be legal and it could be shut down. Now, if these meetings are in a public place, you cannot stop anybody from attending them. So if people are having a meeting protesting against the COVID-19 shutdowns and they are meeting in a public park, you are allowed to go to that meeting. Even if you disagree with them, you're allowed to go to it to see what they're saying and to talk against it. The Supreme Court has made the First Amendment more clear by deciding some important cases. It decided that freedom of assembly covers more than just meetings. It also covers picket lines. And picket lines are workers who are trying to get a change, and they could be fighting for something like higher pay. The Amazon workers I mentioned earlier were saying that their conditions were not safe, saying they needed masks, saying they needed a hand sanitizer, they needed time to go and wash their hands. So they were protesting to get these things changed. The First Amendment protects marchers, protects protesters, protects people who are protesting against things like war. Anyone who is not breaking the law with their protest, the First Amendment protects them. People must be allowed to assemble in public places. So any group can meet in public places, city parks, or streets. So in these pictures here, you can see some picket lines. These are workers at Amazon that are refusing to work because of the unsafe conditions. And in this video clip, you can see people protesting against the government telling you to stay inside, against them doing the quarantine or the stay-at-home order.
Total chaos. Green light. Everybody stopped up.
It's time for our state to be opened up. We're tired of not being able to buy the things that we need, go to the hairdressers, get our hair done. It's time to open up. The sick are being taken care of. If you're sick, stay home and in your house. The ones that can work need to work. We need to open our businesses.
Remember, all Americans have freedom of speech, no matter what their opinion is. If they're wrong or incorrect, or you could even have an ignorant belief. That's one of the costs of freedom of speech. Everyone has it.
I've had a quadruple bypass. I've had a heart attack, a stroke, and I'm still not afraid to go out in public. It's how you take care of yourself. We're not, like I said, we're not her children. Until this virus runs its course, it's going to stay here. And all we're doing is hiding from it.
In this image, you see even unpopular groups get freedom of speech and freedom to protest. And in this video clip coming up, you'll see what happens when two groups of protesters collide and one man decides to break the law and take someone's life.
Go, 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 go.
So freedom of speech would not mean very much if you were not allowed to go public with your ideas. So local governments must also protect those who assemble. So the government actually has to protect you. They have to provide police and protect your right to freedom of speech, even if you are expressing an idea that is unpopular. So in theory, if the KKK wanted to have a meeting talking about white power, if they were not breaking the law and they were just having ignorant ideas, the government would be required to protect them because they have freedom of speech too. Now there are some limits. You can't invite a bunch of people to meet you in Mill Creek Park to plan to rob houses and say that it's freedom of speech, it's freedom to protest. Because robbing houses is breaking a law. So your assembly would have an illegal purpose. Another example of something you wouldn't be allowed to do. You wouldn't be allowed to post on Facebook that you're having a fight club under a bridge and invite 100 people to show up, because that would be breaking the law too. So your freedom to assemble is limited. It's not allowed to break the law in anything you're trying to do. There also can be some limits put on public places. So if you guys come into the classrooms at our school, there's a little sign next to the door that says how many people are allowed to be in a space. So the government can put some limits on these public spaces. They can limit the amount of people allowed in a building, allowed in a specific area. They can also make sure that these protests stay peaceful. They can make sure that picket line workers are not blocking off the roads. They're not allowed to tell these protesters what to say, but they are allowed to give them some kind of guidance in how to handle things peacefully without breaking the law. Now, the example I gave a minute ago with the KKK wanting to give a protest about white power. The police would be required to protect them, but that doesn't mean they have to do it for free. The city can set fees for those kind of people, or for any people who are requiring police services, but those fees legally have to be fair. So they can't charge them more just because they disagree with their idea. So a little bit more detail about petitions now. There's two kinds of petitions. There's official petitions, like referendums, recalls, and initiatives. Those ones have legal power. So if you get enough signatures, something must be done. The government has to follow. The next type of petition is unofficial. It has no legal power, but If you get enough signatures on it, it would be foolish for the government official to ignore it. If you showed up at the mayor's office with a petition about Youngstown's roads and you had 30,000 signatures on it, it would be foolish for him to ignore that, because the next election, if people find out he ignored them, he most likely wouldn't get reelected. So how is the freedom to petition protected? So you have the right to sign a petition if you agree with somebody's idea. You also have the right to ask people to sign your petition in public places. Now, that doesn't mean you could set up inside a McDonald's and ask all of their customers to sign a petition. You would have to be in a public area. You could be on the sidewalk, but not on the store's property. Now, there's some limits to petition as well. People who sign a petition have to write their full name. They usually have to write their address and where they live. And the reason why is you're only allowed to sign petitions for your area. So if I was on my way home from school and I stopped at a store and there was a guy outside asking people to sign petitions, I would be unable to sign it because I don't live in Ohio anymore. You have to live in the town where the petition is being put into effect. You can only sign it once, and you have to use your real name. In some places, you have to actually be a registered voter for your signature to be official. So in Chapter 9, we read about a famous court case, Brown versus Board of Education. And in that case, the Supreme Court eventually decided that segregation in schools was illegal. So all the schools that were set up separately for white and black Americans had to integrate or had to combine. So they had to end this segregation as quickly as possible. And that's where things come into a problem. They didn't give them a specific timeline. So some states decided to drag their feet as slow as they could on recombining the schools. 10 years after the court decided they had to stop, a lot of schools were still segregated. So in 1965, a TV actor and a comedian named Dick Gregory got a bunch of people together to protest. He said the schools in Chicago were moving too slow and they were still segregated. So he got a bunch of people together and they went to go talk to the mayor of Chicago, Richard Daley. They asked him to hire a new superintendent for the schools, and they asked for someone who was going to work to end this segregation quickly. The people in the group decided to organize a march to show how they supported him. So he got people together to show that they really believed in this cause. About 85 of them marched from City Hall to the mayor's house and formed a picket line. Now, if they are standing on the sidewalk and they're not in the mayor's yard, they are allowed to be out there. So here's where it starts to get a little bit sketchy. A bunch of the mayor's supporters show up. So now you have two different sides of the argument, and the crowd grows to over 1,000 people. And it's no longer a peaceful protest. Many of the mayor's friends started harassing and throwing things at the protesters who were trying to desegregate schools. So this is no longer a peaceful protest, it's becoming a riot. So the police get called, and they've been watching this protest. The head of the police began to fear that it was going to turn into a full-out riot and it was going to become chaos. So he asked the protesters, the ones who wanted to desegregate the schools, he said, "Go home." The protesters said, "Nah, we're not doing that." They're not doing anything wrong, and they continued to use their First Amendment. In this image, you can see Dick Gregory and his followers marching from City Hall on their way to the mayor's house to protest against school segregation and make them comply with Supreme Court's decision to integrate schools quickly. So the police said this crowd was getting more and more angry and more violent. And they said they were afraid people were going to get hurt. So they arrest the comedian and his protesters, the ones who were trying to desegregate schools. This made them furious because they weren't the ones throwing things. They weren't the ones actually being violent. So they go to court. It goes to a local Chicago court. And they pointed out they had been peacefully protesting. They said they have the right to assemble. They have the right to march and protest against segregation. And the police chief argued and said, no, it's our job to keep people safe. They thought that they were going to cause a riot, and the local court found that the marchers were guilty. So the first level of court on the local level decided the protesters who wanted to desegregate schools were the ones who were wrong. So some of these people were upset about it. So they used the appeal process, and they appealed their case all the way to the Supreme Court. In 1969, the court unanimously overturned the decision. And if you guys remember, overturned is when they throw out the previous verdict. The court agreed with the marchers, and they said the march was protected by the First Amendment. And they said their peaceful protest was lawful. It was following all the rules. It should not have been shut down. It noted that the police had a responsibility to keep the peace and keep the people safe. The court also pointed out that Daley supporters were the ones causing trouble, not the marchers. It went on to say that the police had a responsibility to protect the marchers, even if they disagreed with them and even if their protest is irritating other people. Okay, guys, we're almost done. We have just a couple more chapters. So go on to Google Classroom, knock out the assignment. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me.